Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Cassie Infante. I'm the statewide organizer at Abundant Housing, Massachusetts. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining our second members forum called MBTA Communities, Next Steps for Advocates. I'm really excited to welcome you all. We have advocates coming from all across the Commonwealth. We have folks from over 15 cities and towns joining us this evening. And as you may have noticed, we are recording this evening's event because we plan on uploading this to AMA's YouTube channel as a resource for folks that couldn't make it. And if that's something that concerns you, we would welcome you to either change your name on the screen and or go off camera. We are here because the goal of our event is to really explore what role advocates play in supporting our cities and towns in the implementation of zoning for multifamily housing and the MBTA's community law. And we're also going to have an opportunity later on for advocates to share a little bit more about the work that they're doing and the work they plan to. And our agenda for this evening is that we'll first hear from Chris Clutchman from DHCD to really help level set and help us understand what are the finalized guidelines and what they mean for our communities. And then in the last portion of the event, we are actually going to split up into community or region specific breakout rooms based on the category of MBTA community that you are, and go into a facilitated discussion. Before we get started, I do want to share a few words of welcome and logistical information. And so we do ask that that you do mute yourself when you're not speaking, just for sound integrity purposes. And we do welcome questions from you for Chris. We'd welcome you to share them in the chat, and we will do our best to answer them in the order that they are received. It is likely that we won't be able to answer every single question, but we will make sure to record those and get back to you if you're able to share your questions in the chat. Lastly, I just want to really welcome everyone for being here, particularly those that are new to AMA and new to the pro-housing movement. If you are new, you might hear a lot of information today that's overwhelming, and I just wanted to reaffirm that you belong in this space. If you believe that housing is a right and you want to help end the housing crisis in Massachusetts, you are in the right place, and we're really grateful that you are here. And with that, I will hand things over to Jesse Kanson-Beninoff, who is our executive director. Oh, and I also, before I do that, I want to just acknowledge and recognize two other AMA staff members that are with us this evening. Cheryl Daniel is our communications and marketing intern. We're really excited to have her on board. And then Mike Kreisberg is our policy research and advocacy intern, who's also here with us this evening and helping us facilitate this event. So with that, I will hand things over to Jesse.
Thank you, Cassie. I appreciate your introduction. I'm just going to introduce our guest, our first guest for this evening, Chris Clutchman. I'm really excited that we have her here. Chris has been a friend of AMA and the pro-housing movement in Massachusetts, even since before we were created as an organization. And I've found her to be an important resource in my work over the years. Chris is an urban planner with over 30 years of experience in state, regional, and municipal planning, housing policy, transportation planning, and public facilitation, and public policy. She has worked in the nonprofit, private, and public sectors. She is at the Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development, where she oversees and coordinates the community services, land use, and planning, technical assistance, and community development functions, providing support and guidance as necessary for land use matters. And in this position, she oversees Governor Baker's Housing Choice Initiative, a program to encourage local governments to increase housing production, make structural changes to Massachusetts land use statutes, reward communities through new capital grants programs, and improve local government access and knowledge of state resources related to housing and planning for housing. And of course, guiding the implementation of the Section 3 MBTA Communities Law, which we will learn about and discuss this evening. So really welcome, Chris, and I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jesse, for those kind words. I think Cassie is going to share her screen, and I'm going to go through a PowerPoint presentation. This is a slightly different presentation than what was given on September the 8th. But if you are interested in that presentation, it is on the DHCD website. And I also understand that Cassie and Jesse are going to make this presentation available in PDF format on their website, in addition to this recording. So you're going to have access to a bunch of new resources. Why don't we just get started right away, Cassie?
Perfect. Can you see the slideshow?
I can see the cover slide. I'm just looking for the next slide.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Sorry. Yes. So often I start these presentations with a lot of data about why we have a housing crisis in Massachusetts. For this presentation, I'm going to skip that. First of all, it's on the September 8th presentation, as well as many other presentations that I've made and other state officials have made over time. But essentially, we believe that the lack of production is one of the main reasons for the high housing costs in Massachusetts. So this law, the new section 3A in chapter 40A, is super important for Massachusetts because it removes barriers that exist in local zoning for 175 communities to encourage and allow for transit-oriented multifamily housing. But many of the communities that are MBTA communities don't have transit stations, but they're adjacent to a community with a transit station. So they're very nearby. And it's also important for those communities to step up and allow for multifamily zoning. As many people have documented, in Massachusetts, local zoning makes permitting multifamily housing unpredictable and the concentration of multifamily permitting is concentrated in only a handful of communities. Boston and about 10 other communities are the ones that are permitting most of the multifamily housing in Massachusetts. So we're really looking at a new paradigm, and we're looking at an opportunity to create set the table for walkable neighborhoods that are served by transit or that are otherwise walkable and connected to existing activities. Let's go to the next slide. But stepping back for a second and going up to the 10,000-foot level, I just want to shout out to Massachusetts. I mean, I did work on this legislation for 5 years, and I'm so happy that it was passed. And we had zoning reform for the first time in 25 years in Massachusetts. And I want to just call out to this group so that you know that Massachusetts really is a leader across the country in this kind of reform at the state level. Oregon and Portland, you may have heard of, are well known for some changes to their state land use laws to require communities to have better zoning. In Portland, they had the residential infill project that is allowing up to 4 homes on almost every residential lot. So they are certainly other leaders. Washington State and Seattle have attempted to do some legislation at the state level, but they have failed and those bills have languished. Let's go to the next slide. You also may have heard about California, where legislators have been working for a long time and have announced that there are deals on certain certain reforms to their zoning and their state framework for zoning. But those have been stalled as well. Although the governor did just sign some major parking reform, and for those of us in the housing space, excessive parking requirements are definitely one of the things that limit multifamily development and all housing development. So that's some progress there. Minneapolis, which many, and I know Jesse knows this well, had adopted a 2040 comprehensive plan that got lots of notice to abolish single family zoning. Unfortunately, that's stalled in the courts right now. And then Connecticut has had some modest reforms to their statewide zoning act and enabling act that changes some of the language that they had, which frankly was pretty problematic, and tries to direct local governments to do a better job at addressing housing needs in their region. Just for those of you who are curious, these states are all the actual size. So it just kind of points out how small Connecticut is compared to most other states. Next slide, please. So I think we can all be proud that of what Massachusetts has done. So just to remind folks, if you haven't been tracking this and living it the way I have, here's a brief timeline of what's happened since the passage of the legislation, since the governor signed the legislation that was actually in the Economic Development Bond Bill. He signed it on January 14th, 2021. And so since then, this chart kind of outlines the activities that we've done at the state level to enact those. So pretty much right away, we enacted some preliminary guidance that said, hey, until we have guidelines, communities are not responsible. So in 2021, folks had a pass on all of the penalties that are part of the law. And so we were working in the background, creating those draft guidelines. And on December 15th, we issued those, and we initiated an over 90-day public comment period on March 31st. Then we took all of those public comments and incorporated them and made pretty significant changes and issued the final guidelines on August 10th. I do want to highlight that there are additional materials that are still going to be coming out in November. We're expecting the compliance model, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But just to summarize, we heard from almost 400 people in terms of public comments. We gave 24 webinars on the draft guidelines, and overall advocates were supportive of the framework that we created. But we heard from a lot of municipal officials and smaller communities that there were some on-the-ground problems with the way that guidelines were framed, and that they would with some certain, on the ground constraints, such as railroad right of way and public, street right of way, that there were going to be some problems in meeting the guidelines. So we really did make substantial changes. I'm not going to focus so much on the changes. I'm going to focus on what is the guidelines. If you're interested in how the draft changed to the final, go back to that September 8th webinar, which is the website will be featured later in this presentation. Next slide. So we've come down from the 10,000-foot view of the whole country, the timeline of what happened in Massachusetts. Now I want to step back again and just give a quick overview of Zoning 101. I know for many of you, you're familiar with this, but we want to make sure everybody's kind of has some basis, because then I'm going to go do a deep dive into these guidelines. So zoning is the primary thing that regulates land uses. It regulates both uses and structures. And furthermore, it regulates the dimensions. How high can things be? How far set back on a lot do they have to be? And this SimCity illustration on the right is a very, very simplified illustration of how different zones are often separated from each other, such as residential, as shown in green. The kind of intermediate thing is blue or gray as commercial, and yellow might be industrial. This is a kind of typical zoning paradigm of separating uses that happens. We are all, as many of you know, we're moving more towards mixing uses and making sure that uses are not necessarily totally separated. But this is just at its very basic. If you go into your community's zoning bylaw or zoning ordinance, you're going to see things like different kinds of residential zones illustrated. You'll see a zoning map that shows where those things are. So it's a very simplified version, but just to let folks know. Next slide, please. And in Massachusetts, we have what happens at the local level, because local communities control the land use and control the zoning. It's local legislative bodies like a city council or a town meeting that have the authority to actually change and create zoning bylaws or zoning ordinances. And what comes up in those local ordinances and bylaws is that they're really focused on local concerns. And these play out in permitting processes as well. So at the local level, people are concerned about traffic and parking. Some people may raise concerns about property values if certain uses are next to each other or integrated. We hear discussions about what community character is, and people raise concerns about school capacity. The problem with this framework is that local concerns don't really get at regional or Commonwealth level concerns, such as the housing economy, which we are right now not doing very well on. Our housing economy is in a state of crisis. They don't address a bigger transportation network that provides transportation connections between communities. And it's difficult to do climate and sustainability at a local level. Watersheds do not comply with municipal boundaries. So this is just a slide to say that, you know, this kind of framework has some problems. Next slide. So as I started out by saying, you know, one of the main effects of this new Section 3A in the State Zoning Act is that it's going to remove barriers for multifamily. On the left-hand side is a picture of a single-family subdivision, which is what a lot of zoning bylaws and ordinances call for in our communities. And that's the kind of development that you would get. On the right is development in the South End in Boston, which was developed before zoning bylaws or zoning ordinances existed in Boston. On the left is probably about 6 units an acre, maybe. On the right is 60 units an acre. So just to give you a sense, this is what on the right, this is what happened before we had zoning. On the left is what happens after we have zoning. Next slide. So the MBTA Communities is really about multifamily zoning, and you may have heard the term missing middle housing that was developed by an architect at Opticos. I've changed this to give this the Massachusetts flavor. They say triple stacked, I say triple decker. But the missing middle housing is really the types of housing that the MBTA Communities law wants to unlock, and is to have zoning that would allow for these kind of developments as of right. That is, it's not held up in discretionary permits that can go on for long periods of time. Next slide. And we're seeing 15 units an acre in many of our communities across the Commonwealth. This housing is not a stranger in Massachusetts. It's not only in triple deckers in Somerville or Cambridge. It exists in suburban areas. It exists in urban areas. It is being built already in the Commonwealth. I raised my family in the town of Lexington, and this picture of Lexington on the lower right is an illustration of a multifamily development that is just about 15 units an acre. It took 2 town meetings and about 3 years of work on the developer to build these 40 units. So that's the kind of delay in process that this new law aims to get rid of. Next slide. So I'm not expecting folks to read this. Again, you'll have this PowerPoint. These 3 paragraphs are the extent of the statute that was passed that added Section 3A to Chapter 40A, which is the Zoning Act. This is it in its entirety. The paragraph 1 sets forward the basic principles, which that an MBTA community must have zoning that allows for multifamily housing that's permitted as of right. That's a reasonable size and that does not restrict for families with children. It has to be a minimum gross density of 15 units an acre, and further, and you know, cannot take into account a couple special environmental laws. Paragraph B describes the penalties, which is that if you fail to comply, you're ineligible for major grant programs and the local capital project fund. And furthermore, it charges my agency, DHCD, to consult with transportation agencies and come up with guidelines. So that's what we're talking about today. Next slide. So now I'm going to kind of break down that the phrases and the paragraph A that described what we were given and how we had to kind of interpret that and come up with guidelines that would help communities comply with this statute. So these are the in blue on the right are the 175 communities that are subject to the MBTA Communities law. The statute of Chapter 161A actually lists all of the MBTA communities. I do note Boston is technically an MBTA community. However, they're not subject to Chapter 40A, the state's zoning act, because they have their own zoning statute. So they are not subject to this law. So that's 170. The 175 does not include Boston, and there are a couple other carve outs because they're not part of, they're not listed in that statute. Roughly, you can describe these as communities that have a fixed transit route, a fixed transit station or asset, and the communities that are adjacent to them. That's a kind of rule of thumb. But if when in doubt, there's actually a list of all of these communities in 161A. Next slide. So what we did, because as you might recognize, these 175 communities, which is almost half of the Commonwealth's communities, are all quite different from each other. So we wanted to come up with a way that we could distinguish different types of communities. And so we looked to the types of transit and created community categories. So this map shows the community categories in the guidelines that were released in August. And they are rapid transit, which is shown here in dark blue. Those are the inner core communities. They're served by subways or light rail, like the Green Line. Commuter rail communities are shown in green, and you can kind of see their lines going out. Adjacent communities are those communities that do not have fixed transit. And then we added a new category called adjacent small town. And these are towns that are less than 7,000 population or less than 500 people per square mile. So they're quite small, have lower capacity at the municipal level, and just had raised many different concerns in the comments on the draft. So keep this map in mind. This is on the website at mass.gov/MBTA Communities. As we go through the next slides, think about what your community is. I know Cassie's going to have us break out into breakout groups. So let's go on to the next slide, where I'm going to talk a little bit more about how these categories relate to the regulations and the guidelines. The first thing that we had to, one of the first things, so we created these categories to help us organize the framework of the guidelines. And then we needed to start to tackle what was reasonable size. And we used two metrics for this: a land area, or a minimum land area, and unit capacity. We wanted the land area. We want communities to be planning for neighborhood scale neighborhoods. We wanted it to be part of transit station walkshed, which is that half-mile boundary. We wanted to make sure that we understood land that is not suitable for housing, such as rail right-of-way or highway right-of-way. And we wanted to make sure that it was taken into account. And we also are using the total municipal land as one of the factors that we looked at. Unit capacity is something that we came up with that says that based on an existing housing stock in each community, that based on your community category that I just showed in the map, that there's a certain percentage of units that should be, that the zoning district should have the capacity to allow. And I'm going to talk more about that. Let's go to the next slide. So talking just a little bit about the minimum land area, there are, again, two factors here. Most communities have a minimum land area of 50 acres. We think that's an appropriate neighborhood scale planning size. It's about 1/10 of the half-mile radius around a transit station. So if you've been looking at maps that show transit or thinking about station areas, you'll often have this half-mile radius. That's about 500 acres. So 50 acres is 1/10 of that. But we also created in the final guidelines some circuit breakers or relief from communities that had special situations. So we have some very small communities that are part of these communities. So like Winthrop or Hull. And so if you know, for a small community, 50 acres may be a big percentage of their actual land area. So we created a cap of 1.5% of total developable land area for the state, for what would be required for the minimum land area. And then we also removed a minimum land area from those adjacent small towns. They still have to meet the 15 units per acre, but there's no specific, there's a derived minimum land area for those. This seems a little abstract until you look at a table with all of these. And I think it makes sense for folks to kind of look at a table that looks at their community, and then you can see, and there's a table that lists each municipality with their minimum land area and their multifamily unit capacity and some other metrics that were used to derive those. So I would encourage you to spend some time there, and you can even download the Excel file of the entire areas. Next. So if you want to have something that makes you think about what is 50 acres, as it happens, while Boston is not one of our communities, many people are familiar with the Boston Common. It is exactly 50 acres. And so if anybody's ever telling you like, well, I don't really understand what 50 acres is, have them think about the Boston Common, not the public garden, just the Boston Common. And if you've ever walked around on the Boston Common, that will give you a sense of what a neighborhood of 50 acres would be. And so we put this in here, understanding that Boston's a very urban community, but yeah, I think it's something that many people in the Commonwealth are familiar with and can help them understand what scale we're talking about here. Next. So talking about the minimum unit capacity, again, which is a concept that we've come up with to have a clear and objective standard that we would expect all communities to meet in their reasonable size. This is part of that reasonable size determination. So again, the primary driver is the existing housing stock based on 2020 census. The community categories have different percentages. And so what this chart on this page shows is that the higher category multiplier is the rapid transit. So the inner core communities have a higher multiplier, and then the adjacent small towns have the lowest, and it goes down by steps. This chart also gives the number of communities that are in each one of those categories so that you don't have to count all of them on the map. You can just see that. We also created a ceiling that no community would have a minimum unit capacity that would exceed 25%. So some of the smaller communities could have a higher capacity based on a minimum land area, but everybody is capped at 25%. So nobody exceeds the rapid transit multiplier. Next slide. Another important, and so I'm talking now about the community categories, and a really important concept for folks to understand. And again, I do appreciate that this is a pretty deep dive, deep into how we're thinking about these. But an important concept is developable station area. And the final guidelines came out with this, defined it very specifically. These are areas that actually could be developed with multifamily housing. And Arlington is the example that I like to give. If you can see down in the bottom right-hand corner of this kind of green picture, you'll see a circle. That circle is the half-mile radius around the Alewife transit station. That's the end of the red line. As you can see, it's just a small part that's in Arlington, and a lot of it is actually wetlands or taken up by right-of-way of Route 2. So we created a threshold that for community categories, each community had to have at least 100 acres of developable station area in order to be deemed in that category. So for example, here, Arlington, that like little wedge of the circle around Alewife is only 58 developable acres within the station area. So Arlington changed from a rapid transit community because our first cut at that was, it was near Alewife, and so therefore it was rapid transit. And in the end, it became an adjacent community, which changed a bunch of metrics that Arlington would have to follow. And I like to give this as an example. However, we did some things to balance this out because this did affect some communities and drop them down in certain categories because of these on the ground issues. Next slide. So here's the kind of balance to that change that we made, is that we added table 2 in the guidelines. And table 2 makes a sliding scale for the more transit station area or that you have in your community. And here I have a map of Needham, which is a transit rich community. They have 4 commuter rail stations. So we have the more station area, developable station area, which is just important because again, we're taking out right of way and wetlands from that, for example. They have over 1,200 developable station areas. And so what we have is the more station area that you have in your community, the higher the requirement is for you to locate that multifamily district in the station area. So this is, if you're a transit-rich community, these guidelines say that you have to put more of your multifamily district in these areas. And I want to point out that it's not just land area. It's both reasonable size factors have to be within this state, within these areas by these proportions here that's shown in the chart. And that is the land area and the unit capacity. So if you're Needham, you could not put more than 10% of your unit capacity anywhere but within these station areas. And that's of the district, the district that people will use to comply. So this was a big, again, a big change, and in my mind, a balance to that change of how we did the community categories. Next slide. The last thing I want to talk about is the as of right zoning, and this was also in the statute. And this is as of right zoning is development that proceeds under a zoning ordinance without a need for a discretionary permit, like a special permit, a variance, or a zoning amendment. And then, so we have some rules in the final guidelines about site plan review. We clarify that site plan review is an acceptable use. We have some limits on affordability and inclusionary zoning, but some is explicitly allowed. Mixed use development where commercial development is required is not compliant, because that's not multifamily by right, because that zoning would be requiring a different use, is requiring a commercial use. We understand that this kind of goes against some planning principles of requiring mixed use in certain areas. Mixed use can be allowed, but it cannot be required as part of the zoning district. And finally, for energy efficiency, multifamily housing in the district cannot have higher energy standards than other uses. So for example, you can't require multifamily to have higher energy standards than single family. It's okay to have high energy standards. They just have to be consistent across all uses in your community. Next slide. So just to wrap up on the kind of rules and the guidelines, there are two compliance mechanisms. One is interim compliance called an action plan that may be submitted. There is a deadline for action plans of January 31st, 2023. An action plan is not required, but is probably recommended for folks to come into that interim compliance as they are working on their districts. And then district compliance is when you submit after a community has adopted the zoning, has shown that they meet their multifamily unit capacity and other metrics, and then they submit it to us. And so those dates, those deadlines vary by community type, with rapid transit being the first and the adjacent small towns having the longest lead time. Next slide. And so the action plan is this interim compliance. It can be found on online. It's a form. We have a form that we'd like people to submit. It must be submitted by the municipality. This is not something that residents would submit. And this basically sketches out a schedule of how folks are going to achieve their multifamily district. And I think it's going to be something you guys are going to talk about something that you might want to make sure that your community is thinking about all of the different steps that they're going to need to go through. Next slide. And I just want to acknowledge that at DHCD, we're creating a brand new program. We have a 40R program, we have the 40B program, we have lots of different programs, but this MBTA community compliance or Section 3A compliance is an entirely new program. We're hiring new staff to staff that, and we'll have ongoing staffing to support it over time. Next slide. I wanted to talk just briefly, and I'm trying to be cognizant. I want you guys to have lots of time to talk, but I wanted to just outline the technical assistance. We have a fair amount of funding, both from that's appropriated by the state, that's in capital grant programs, and that our partners like Mass Housing Partnership have established to provide technical assistance to all communities that want it in order to comply. And those releases can be found online. And we're continuing to work on additional resources such as a sample bylaw that will be available in November, user's guide for communities about how to go through this process, and then the compliance model. Next slide. I'm going to skip pretty quickly through the slide. This it gives the MHP web address. They have already had one round of technical assistance, and they will be opening up other rounds of technical assistance for municipalities. I run 3 different grant programs of $11.5 million every year. The MBTA community compliance can be funded, work can be funded out of any one of those. EEA has a program, and regional planning agencies will also be supporting communities in their compliance efforts. Next slide. So I'm going to very quickly talk about the compliance model and the compliance process. This is the methodology. You heard me talk about the multifamily unit capacity, and you may have wondered, how are communities going to figure out what is the capacity of a zoning district? Or even if you're looking at a couple different scenarios, how will communities be able to actually figure out that capacity? We have a tool, which we call the compliance model, that will be required for communities to submit with their compliance, their district compliance. It's not out yet. It's coming out in November. But it's been developed by a group of super smart people, smarter than me. It uses GIS and an Excel workbook, and essentially goes through a process to have zoning metrics input from the community. This illustration on the left shows the example of a potential district, and that's in GIS. That is exported into an Excel file that goes through a whole bunch of complicated formulas that are linked with the zoning metrics. And in the end, you'll come out with estimates like that's shown on the right, that are the estimates of what the district acreage is, what its unit capacity is, its density, and the percentage within the station areas. These are all the metrics that communities will have to tell us that they're meeting in order to be compliant with the multifamily district zoning. Tom Hopper at Mass Housing Partnership is an expert on this, and the September 8th webinar includes about an 8-minute segment where he explains this in much more detail. And so if you're interested in that, I recommend zipping past my part and going to Tom Hopper and listening to him in detail. Next. And finally, I just want to end with a question that we get all the time, and this is part of the model, but it's also part of the concept of unit capacity. People ask us, can I count existing development in our unit capacity number? And the answer is actually no. The way the compliance model will work is that it treats the parcels as if they were undeveloped, but it takes the zoning metrics that are going to be in that multifamily district. And let's say in this case, we have a parcel that has a duplex on it, but the zoning that's being permitted and would be adopted would allow for a fourplex. You don't do anything with a duplex, you just kind of build in, okay, well, a fourplex could be built on this, so the unit capacity of this lot is not 2, but it is 4. So that's a really important concept. Next slide. So I hope that in this brief introduction that you've gotten some ideas about why municipalities are really important, because they control local zoning, what that Section 3A legislation is, and then that this is about zoning for capacity. We are not asking folks to tell us how many units get built. Under this, we're really wanting to remove the barrier to zoning. And right now, this Section 3A is focused on establishing these zoning districts. And I think that's it, Cassie.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. If everyone wants to use their reaction emojis to give Chris a round of applause, we really appreciate all of that great information. And at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Jesse to facilitate the Q&A portion. We do have just until about 6:50 to take some of the questions that were submitted, but we do encourage folks, if your question doesn't get answered, You can also bring your question into your breakout room discussion. And if we aren't able to answer it there, we will follow up with you with more answers and resources. So I'm going to turn things over to Jesse.
Yeah, thank you, Cassie, and thank you, Chris, for that really helpful presentation. I've done my best to try to group questions that came through the chat and were submitted with registrations together. And any questions, as Cassie said, that we can't get to, we will try to get answers from Chris or her team offline and provide them to all registrants. So there are a few questions that came in both during registration and the chat around how the state will ensure that communities are complying with the law. Kelly, who's here today, said, can communities that fail to comply with 3A be compelled to do so, as the law is a, quote, must and not a may? And then similarly, someone submitted a question, how will the state ensure that MBTA communities that are currently contributing the least to regional housing around MBTA public transit stops will indeed rezone to the required level of density around such stations?
Thanks, Jesse. Those are good questions. We do think of this as a mandate. We do think that all of this 175 are required to comply. However, the legislation does list 3 specific penalties. It's possible that this may be settled in litigation. I can't say. I'm not an attorney. Whether somebody brings a suit to a community that refuses to comply and kind of says, well, I just don't care about this funding, that's yet to be seen. One thing that has been, so there's you lose eligibility for MassWorks, which is the state's primary public works funding source for infrastructure. I think the Boston Indicators put out a chart. It's a little out of date, but they did a chart that shows how much the MBTA communities have received over a certain point of time. Again, that's not my data, but that's, if you want to know about that, that might be a useful resource for you to let your community know how much you've received in those grants. Housing choice grants, of course, are part of that. And then the Local Capital Project Fund is currently makes up 10% of the Public Housing Authority's operating expenditures in DHCD. So the communities that are non-compliant and that have housing authorities, those housing authorities face the possibility of losing 10% of their operating subsidies. And that is being implemented now we have a very small handful of communities that did not comply with the requirements for 2022. They are being informed that their housing authorities may lose that 10% of their funding. And for those of you that understand housing authorities, they operate on shoestring budgets as it is.
Thank you, Chris. Another couple questions, particularly some folks in Newton were wondering about their existing inclusionary zoning law. I know we have folks in other communities that have inclusionary zoning as well. Sean and asked, Newton has an existing inclusionary zoning ordinance, but it provides for units at a level below 80% AMI. Will our AMI levels be included as incumbent IZ? And then someone followed up and said, is correct that since Newton's IZ ordinance predates the MBTA communities law, it will be grandfathered. It exceeds 10% of 80% AMI, but getting a little complicated there. But I think the underlying question here is, what steps would Newton need to take to confirm this?
Yeah, so I'm not going to answer the question directly. I mean, if anybody wants, I can go over exactly what the guidelines say, but it allows 10% of units at exactly 80% of AMI to have inclusionary zoning that meets that. So if you didn't have any inclusionary zoning and you wanted to have that, the guidelines clearly say you could do that. It does allow for some exceptions with inclusionary zoning districts that predated, but it does cap those at 20% of units, and it's still at 80% of AMI, or area median income. And the communities have to demonstrate that that's not stopping production. The concern on our end is that communities may seek overly high affordability rates that would not work in their market, and they would be using that as a way to turn down housing, and so to make housing infeasible to build. And so that's the kind of rationale behind why we have these restrictions and limits on the inclusionary zoning. I want to say we have heard concerns from several different communities that have deeper affordability, and we're taking those under consideration at this time.
Thank you, Chris. Just a couple of minutes here, so I'll try to get some quick ones in. If a district allows both multi-use buildings or mixed-use buildings, I think, and all residential, would that comply?
Yeah, then again, with zoning, you get into the weeds really fast. So mandatory mixed use would not comply. So if you had a zoning provision that said on Main Street, in this district on Main Street, you must build commercial on the first floor, and then you could build apartments above, that would not be compliant because that's not multifamily as of right. You're telling a developer who's coming in with a project, you have to do something else besides multifamily. The statute is crystal clear. This is for mandatory multifamily by right. So mixed use can be allowed. There probably are incentives that could be built into zoning to encourage somebody, let's say a density bonus, for example, if you build commercial on the first floor, but you may not require it. And again, you're getting kind of really into the weeds and explicit zoning, but that's really important.
Great. I'm going to try to get two related questions in here before we hit our deadline here. Sarah asks, can a portion of the district for a given community be within or walkable to a bus line, or must it be within an MBTA commuter rail station area? And then similarly, just on the topic of type of station or type of transit service, if a commuter rail community has 2 stations, are they then required to have 2 such districts? And how does that come together with total developable land area? So you can answer either order.
So I'm going to just direct people to in the guidelines. If you're looking for location requirements, they are contained in section 5 and section 8. That's just one if you want to go do your own homework. I'm going to take the second question about the 2 stations because I think it's a little easier concept to get at. Which is that there are 2 kinds of areas as we think of it. There's going to be the transit station area and the non-transit station area. And so if you have 2 transit stations in your community, you're going to, in table 2, you have a percentage that has to be within that. It may be 0, but it may be 20%, it may be 50%, it may be 75 or 90. So you have to look at that transit station area. Again, word neutral to which station. You could put most of it near one station or all of it near one station if that's what you want, but it's going to be dependent on that table 2. But we're really looking at just transit station area. Doesn't have to be 2 different districts. I mean, you can have the same district that is geographically in different parts of a community. So for example, an overlay district, you can have an overlay district that might be near, I'm going to say Belmont, Waverly Station, and the Belmont Center Station. It could be the same overlay district, the transit-oriented development multifamily district, let's just say, but it exists in 2 different geographic locations. If that helps.
Yeah, that does. Thank you very much. Again, any questions we didn't get to, we will provide to Chris and her team to get some more clarification on and provide answers to everyone who's participating today. So thank you very much, Chris. I know you're going to be sticking around. I'm going to hand it over to Cassie to get into some strategy.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you so much, Chris. And so at this point, we are going to be moving into the next portion of our event, which will end with breakout rooms. Our event does go until about 7:30, so we're hoping that folks can stick around with us and engage in discussion. Before we move into breakout rooms, I would like to share a few slides just on what we feel is really the advocate's role between now and January 2023 in supporting implementation. So if you give me one moment, I'll share my screen. Great. So in these few slides, I want to just remind members of the AMA's network of some of the resources that we have developed and to really support you in developing your advocacy strategy within your community. We're going to talk a little bit about what some of the next steps are for us, and then we'll go into breakout rooms for about 20 minutes. And really the bottom line that we really want to emphasize for everyone here is that at this point in your advocacy, municipal leaders really need to know that there are members in their community that support this law. And so if you remember when the guidelines were first announced, there were a few communities with really strong concerns and pushback. And so we need to really remind them of the public support that's behind this law. And you don't have to be an expert to do that and to take action today. And so that's really, really the basis of what we want to affirm for you today. And so where we've been in the past, and just as a refresher of some of the things that are available to you now and that we will reshare after this event, is that, as Chris mentioned, there is so much technical assistance and trainings available from MHP and DHCD. So if you'll excuse me, DHCD is not on the slide, but we just want to remind you that every webinar that has been recorded is made available on the website. And that information is available to you, as well as to share with your elected officials. And that from AMA, the last time we hosted a conversation in March, we had a few resources that I wanted to remind folks of, which is, the first is a frequently asked questions and frequent rebuttals document. And so this is really helpful if you are currently engaging with elected leaders or your municipal leaders or planning department, and you're hearing a lot of sort of pushback to the guidelines. What are those frequent rebuttals, and how should an advocate respond to them? And then finally, there's an advocacy framework that was shared in the March event that really helps you get clear on what are the steps that we should take within my current capacity, if you're a solo advocate or if you're a part of a member organization. And so looking forward, at this point, we really believe that advocates should stay within what we call an inside game strategy. And so this concept is really popular in social movement ecology. And it's just to say that right now, in the next couple of months before the end of the year, we really think that it's not necessarily time for sort of loud public demonstrations. It's really time to focus on your elected or municipal leaders, the power and decision makers that have the power to comply with these guidelines. Really focus on partnering with them. And so if you are someone who is sort of a solo advocate, you're not currently connected to a pro-housing organization, reach out to us. We would like to help you find at least 2 to 4 more people to help you take action. And then the next step that we really recommend before January is make sure that you're corresponding with your planning department or your municipal leaders. And you can do that in 2 ways. You can send a letter asking for information on how the community plans on complying with the MBTA law. And we actually created a template to help you do that. So all you have to do is plug in your community's information. Or if you feel comfortable, you can also request a meeting with them. I know that there's advocates here tonight that have already done that. And these are some of the things that when you connect with your planning department, these are some of the things that you should be asking. And I know Chris spoke about this as well. But you want to really ask, how does our community currently comply, or how might we reach interim compliance, if at all? And has the planning department requested technical assistance? As Chris mentioned, there's so much help available to communities. And so if there has been inaction, and that inaction is rooted in sort of not understanding the guidelines, know and remind your planning department that there are plenty of resources available. And then, of course, you want to ask, is there a plan to submit the action plan due in January? And as Chris mentioned, those are due January 31st. And I really would treat that as a requirement because for these communities that take early action, we know that's really an act of good faith and compliance. And if you feel comfortable and want to take it a step further, we really encourage you to meet with the planning department and brainstorm ideas on how to reach compliance. If you are someone with a planning background, feel free to really bring your ideas to your planning department and really frame this as a community engagement opportunity. Okay, so that is enough for me. We are going to move into breakout rooms for the next 20 minutes. And what I will share in terms of directions is that these breakout rooms have been pre-assigned based on the information that you provided during registration. And so if you are someone who registered with a Boston address, because Boston is not an MBTA community, you were assigned a room at random. There's 3 different rooms separated by community category: rapid transit, commuter rail, an adjacent community or small town. And we are really grateful to have guest lead facilitators with us tonight. So we have Katie Lacey, who is a senior planner at Mass Housing Partnership, Lily Link, who is the Municipal Engagement Program Associate at CHAPA, and then Chris has also volunteered her time to stay and help us facilitate breakout rooms just to answer any questions that folks might have. Welcome back, everyone. We have just under 5 minutes left, and so we wanted to share some closing announcements before we end for today. And so I'm going to turn things over to Jesse.
Thanks, Cassie. I gave a little preview to all of this in our breakout group. I did want to say, though, first that this is the sort of we're still an early stage of this conversation. I won't say it's the beginning because as Tom pointed out, in our group, this has been around for 18, 19 months now. So it's been a long time coming, and we hosted a conversation earlier this year when the draft guidelines from DHCD came out. So this is really just still an early continuation of that conversation. I am really excited, though, to let everyone know, and I'm sorry we lost some folks that were here earlier, but please pass this news on. Really excited to let everyone know that thanks to some of the support that we'll be formally announcing in coming weeks from one of the community foundations in the Boston area, we're going to be able to expand the Abundant Housing Massachusetts staff, hire a couple new organizers, and do some real intentional organizing, capacity building, and assistance to you, our members, in the impacted MBTA communities to make sure that you have sort of the skills and resources you need to be effective advocates for your community, to pass zoning bylaws that do comply with this law and the guidelines, the DHCD guidelines. So, stay tuned for more on this to come. If you know folks who you think are qualified organizers who would like to be working full time on this, please, pass them our way, but stay tuned to your email for more formal announcement on our expanded capacity at Abundant Housing Massachusetts to be doing real intentional organizing to support the effectiveness and implementation of the MBTA Communities law. So that's what I wanted to share. I'll pass it back to Cassie to close us out.
Thank you, Jesse. I just wanted to share, I'm really excited, first of all, for us to expand our work in this area. And I wanted to share a few closing asks and announcements. The first of which is we have an active action alert right now asking members of our network to send a letter to members of the conference committee in support of legalizing ADUs by right across the state in the final economic development bill. So many of you might have heard or read in our newsletter that the legislature recently is revisiting the economic development bill. And so we're still really hopeful that this segment that we've been pushing for months will pass. And so I'm going to drop the link in the chat. If you haven't already, please sign and share this action alert. And then two other things. If you'd like more targeted support, we'd encourage you, of course, to really check out resources made available by CHAPA, MHP, DHCD. If you'd like to meet with myself and Jesse, we'd always welcome you to do that using our Calendly links. And so I know Lily just dropped her link in the chat as well. Thank you, Lily. We want to make that offer to you as well, that you can follow those URLs and schedule time with us to continue this conversation. And then finally, we would love your feedback on this event. So we want to make sure that everything we're doing really appropriately meets the need of our members. And so we ask that if you have a few minutes, this is only like a 2 or 3 question form. Please submit this form and let us know how you felt about this event and maybe what you might want moving forward. And then of course, I have like 1,000,001 things. Of course, if you are not following us already, here are all of our social media links. So this is a great way to stay in touch with us and everything we have going on. So I just wanted to make sure I shared those links. And I think with that, I will give folks just a few seconds to catch up with the amount of links that are in the chat. I want to take this moment to thank again Chris Clutchman of DHCD. Thank you so much for your time this evening. I know there have been so many presentations, and we appreciate you being here as an add-on. Lily Link from CHAPA, as well as Katie Lacey from MHP. Thank you so much for being with us and helping to facilitate breakout rooms. And with that, I will wish everyone a good evening. We are going to send all of these resources shared tonight in an email tomorrow. So I hope you have a great evening. Thank you, everyone.